The morning fog clung to San Francisco's towering courthouse as Isabella Kim nervously adjusted her daughter Luna's navy blue collar for the third time. The 10-year-old girl fidgeted with her long black hair braided neatly down her back, while her mother's trembling fingers smoothed imaginary wrinkles from her carefully chosen outfit. They were attending what should have been a simple property dispute case, a neighborly disagreement over a shared fence line that had somehow escalated to the county courts. "Ma, you're doing it again," Luna whispered, gently catching her mother's restless hands. Isabella managed a weak smile, realizing she'd been fussing with Luna's clothes like she used to do before elementary school piano recitals. But this wasn't a performance. It was just another Tuesday morning in Courtroom 7A. Inside the majestic building, their footsteps echoed against the polished marble floors as they joined the steady stream of people heading through security. The courthouse hummed with its usual morning energy. Lawyers clutching coffee cups and briefcases, court clerks rushing with stacks of papers, and citizens like themselves, each carrying their own stories and anxieties. On the 7th floor, Judge David Ramirez stood before the mirror in his chambers, adjusting his black robes with practiced precision. 20 years on the bench had taught him to maintain an air of calm authority, regardless of the cases before him. His clerk, Jenny Martinez, knocked briefly before entering with his morning docket. "Light morning, Your Honor," Jenny said, placing the files on his desk. "Property dispute at 9, then 2 small claims cases before lunch." She paused, tapping a bright yellow sticky note. "The Kim Anderson fence case might be interesting. Apparently, there's some historical property line documentation involved." Judge Ramirez nodded, picking up the first file. At 45, he'd earned a reputation for fairness and efficiency in handling civil cases. His colleagues often joked that he could settle a neighborhood dispute faster than most people could order lunch. But beneath his professional demeanor, something felt different about this morning. A strange anticipation hung in the air, like the charged atmosphere before a storm. As the clock struck 9, Courtroom 7 filled with the usual suspects, legal aides, curious law students observing from the back rows, and the parties involved in the day's first case. The morning sun streamed through the high windows, casting long shadows across the room's dark wooden furnishings and illuminating dancing dust motes in its golden beams. Isabella guided Luna to a seat in the 3rd row, smoothing her own charcoal pencil skirt as she sat. Her eyes darted between her phone, where her sister Grace kept sending encouraging messages, and the imposing judge's bench at the front of the room. Luna, meanwhile, seemed unusually focused on her surroundings, her dark eyes wide as she took in every detail of the courtroom. "All rise." The bailiff's voice rang out as Judge Ramirez entered the courtroom. The Superior Court of San Francisco County is now in session, the Honorable Judge David Ramirez presiding. As the judge took his seat and began his routine morning instructions, no one in the courtroom could have predicted how this ordinary Tuesday would unfold. Not the court reporter testing her stenography machine, not Jenny organizing exhibits at her desk, and certainly not Judge Ramirez himself as he glanced down at the first case file. But Luna knew. Something inside her had shifted the moment she saw him enter. Her small hands gripped the wooden bench in front of her, and her heart pounded with a truth she discovered just days ago. A truth that was about to shatter the careful quiet of Courtroom 7A. The property dispute hearing droned on as Mr. Anderson presented his case about the contested fence line, but Luna barely heard a word. Her attention remained fixed on Judge Ramirez's face, studying every detail with the intense focus only a child could maintain without drawing attention. Last Wednesday's discovery in their attic kept playing through her mind like a movie she couldn't pause. She had been helping her mother organize old boxes, searching for photos for her school's family heritage project. While Isabella was downstairs answering a work call, Luna had found a dusty shoebox tucked behind her mother's old law school yearbooks. Inside, beneath a faded red ribbon, she discovered a photograph that would change everything. The image showed a younger version of her mother, laughing at some forgotten joke, her arm linked with a man's at what looked like a cultural festival. Paper lanterns hung in the background, and cherry blossom petals scattered across the ground around them. Luna had seen countless photos of her mother before, but this one was different. The man in the photo, his smile, his distinctive dimple, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners, it was like looking at a younger version of the judge now sitting before her. Judge Ramirez paused to take a sip of water, and Luna watched as that same dimple appeared when he pressed his lips together. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out her phone, carefully hidden in her lap. She opened her photo gallery where she'd saved a picture of the old photograph, holding it at an angle that her mother couldn't see. The resemblance was undeniable. The same strong jawline, the gentle slope of his nose, and most striking of all, those eyes. Luna had always wondered why her eyes were shaped differently from her mother's, with that unusual gray-blue tint that none of her maternal relatives shared. Now, watching Judge Ramirez peer over his reading glasses of the property documentation, she saw those same eyes staring back at her. Her mind raced through 1,000 little moments. Her mother's evasive answers about her father, the way she changed the subject when Luna asked about him, the mysterious child support checks that arrived each month with no sender's name. Isabella had always said Luna's father was someone very important who couldn't be part of their lives, and Luna had eventually stopped asking. In the gallery, Isabella shifted uncomfortably in her seat, perhaps sensing her daughter's unusual stillness. She reached over to squeeze Luna's hand, misinterpreting her intensity for boredom. "Just a little longer, sweetheart," she whispered, but Luna barely registered her mother's words. Instead, she was remembering the other items she found in that shoebox. A Stanford Law School graduation program, a handwritten letter she hadn't dared to read, and a small origami crane with DR written in faded ink on one wing. The same initials that were now displayed on the judge's bench, Honorable David Ramirez. As Mr. Anderson and his neighbor argued about property surveys and historical boundaries, Luna felt a strange calm settling over her. The kind of calm that comes with absolute certainty. She watched as Judge Ramirez leaned forward, his familiar eyes scanning the room while he asked a clarifying question about the fence's location. In that moment, Luna knew what she had to do. The truth wasn't just a possibility anymore. It was sitting right there in front of her, wearing black robes and holding a gavel. Her heart raced with the weight of her discovery, and she could feel the words building in her throat, waiting for the right moment to change everything. Judge Ramirez called for a 10-minute recess, his gavel striking the sound block with a sharp crack that made Luna flinch. As people began shuffling papers and rising from their seats, she felt the moment approaching like a wave about to break. Her mother had stepped into the aisle to answer a text from her office, creating the window of opportunity Luna had been waiting for. The courtroom buzzed with quiet conversation as attorneys consulted with their clients, and the court reporter stretched her fingers. Judge Ramirez remained at his bench, reviewing notes from the morning's proceedings. Through the tall windows behind him, the San Francisco fog had finally lifted, allowing sunshine to stream in and create a perfect halo around his distinguished silver-streaked hair. Luna's hands were trembling as she slowly stood up. She could hear her heartbeat drumming in her ears, drowning out the ambient noise of the courtroom. Her mouth felt dry, but her conviction remained unshaken. This was her moment, their moment, and she couldn't let it slip away. "Luna, where are you going?" Isabella whispered urgently, turning back from her phone call to see her daughter standing. But Luna was already moving, her small feet carrying her forward with determined steps. The bailiff, Officer James Torres, noticed her movement and took a half-step forward, but something in Luna's expression made him pause. Perhaps it was the intense look of purpose in her eyes, or the way she carried herself with such certainty despite her young age. "Your Honor," Luna's clear voice cut through the courtroom chatter. The conversations around her died instantly, replaced by a curious silence. Judge Ramirez looked up from his papers, his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. Isabella's phone clattered to the floor. "Luna, honey, what are you doing?" she called out, her voice tight with panic. But it was too late. Luna stood in the center aisle, her navy blue dress wrinkle-free thanks to her mother's nervous adjustments earlier that morning. Her black braid hung perfectly straight down her back, swaying slightly as she raised her arm, pointing directly at Judge Ramirez with unwavering certainty. "You're my dad." The words rang out like a thunderclap in the hushed courtroom. Judge Ramirez's glasses slipped from his fingers, landing on the bench with a soft clatter. His face, usually composed and professional, transformed with shock as he stared at the young girl before him. Isabella rushed forward, her heels clicking rapidly against the wooden floor. "Luna, please, we need to." "I found the photo in the attic," Luna continued, her voice growing stronger. "The one from the Stanford Festival. I have your eyes and your dimple when you smile. Mom never told me, but I know it's true." The courtroom erupted in gasps and whispers. Jenny Martinez, the court clerk, sat frozen at her desk, her hand suspended over her keyboard. Mr. Anderson and his neighbor, whose fence dispute now seemed trivially unimportant, exchanged stunned glances. Judge Ramirez gripped the edge of his bench, his knuckles white against the dark wood. His eyes, those distinctive gray-blue eyes that Luna had inherited, darted between the young girl and Isabella, who had reached her daughter and stood trembling beside her. For the first time in his 20 years on the bench, Judge David Ramirez found himself completely speechless. The gavel lay forgotten beside him as he stared at Luna's face, really seeing it for the first time. Recognition flickered across his features as pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed suddenly fell into place. Officer Torres stepped forward, uncertain how to handle this unprecedented situation. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, illuminating the dust motes that swirled around the three figures frozen in this life-changing tableau: the judge, the mother, and the brave young girl who had just rewritten their story with 5 simple words. Within seconds, Judge Ramirez's composed world erupted into barely controlled chaos. He raised his hands, commanding attention over the growing murmurs that filled courtroom 7A. "This court is in recess until tomorrow morning," he announced, his voice carrying the slightest tremor that only those who knew him well might detect. "Mr. Anderson, Mrs. Peterson, my sincere apologies. We'll resume your case first thing tomorrow." Jackson Wong, a veteran reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle, who had been covering a different case down the hall, appeared in the doorway. He'd been tipped off by a courthouse regular about some kind of commotion in Judge Ramirez's courtroom. His experienced eyes quickly assessed the scene, the distinguished judge looking shaken, a young Asian American girl with fierce determination written across her face, and a woman who seemed caught between reaching for her daughter and shrinking into herself. Officer Torres stepped forward, positioning himself between the growing crowd of spectators and the 3 central figures of this unfolding drama. "Please clear the courtroom," he announced, his voice firm but gentle. The bailiff had seen many things in his 15 years at the courthouse, but nothing quite like this. Jenny Martinez was already on the phone with Judge Ramirez's judicial assistant, canceling his afternoon appointments. She watched as curious law clerks and attorneys lingered by the doorway, phones discreetly pointed toward the scene. No recordings in the courtroom, she reminded them sharply, her protective instincts kicking in for the judge she'd worked with for the past 5 years. Isabella finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "David." It was the first time she'd spoken his name in over a decade, and the sound of it seemed to snap Judge Ramirez out of his daze. "My chambers," he managed, rising from the bench. "Officer Torres, please escort Ms. Kim, and—" He paused, looking at Luna with new eyes, "and her daughter to my chambers. Jenny, please join us as a witness." As they moved toward the judge's private office, whispers followed them like a trail of smoke. Luna walked with her head high, even as her mother's hand gripped her shoulder with trembling fingers. The click of Isabella's heels against the marble floor echoed through the now hushed corridor. Outside the courthouse, word spread with the speed of breaking news in the digital age. Junior clerks texted their colleagues, and within minutes, reporters began gathering at the courthouse steps. The story was too compelling to ignore. A respected judge, a surprise revelation, a child's brave declaration. In the relative quiet of his chambers, Judge Ramirez loosened his collar and sank into his leather chair. Family photos lined his desk, his parents, his sisters, his nieces and nephews, but now these familiar faces seemed to watch him with new scrutiny. How had he never noticed that Luna's eyes were exactly like his mother's? "I need to recuse myself from all cases for the rest of the day," he informed Jenny, who nodded and slipped out to make the necessary arrangements. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving David, Isabella, and Luna in a heavy silence broken only by the muffled sounds of the courthouse beyond the thick wooden door. Luna stood between her parents, her small hands clasped in front of her navy blue dress. The morning sun streaming through the window caught the slight tremor in her fingers, the only sign that her confidence might be wavering now that the moment of truth had passed. Officer Tourist stationed himself outside the chamber doors, turning away the curious and the concerned alike. Inside, 3 lives hung suspended in this moment, each person wrestling with their own version of the truth that had just been laid bare in front of a courtroom full of strangers. The antique clock on Judge Ramirez's wall ticked heavily through the silence. Isabella sat perched on the edge of a leather chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap as Luna settled into the seat beside her. David had removed his judicial robes, looking suddenly more human and less imposing in his charcoal suit. The Stanford Cherry Blossom Festival, Isabella finally began, her voice soft but steady. Spring semester, final year of law school. She reached into her purse and withdrew the photograph Luna had discovered, now carefully preserved in a clear sleeve. David took it with trembling fingers. The image transported him back 11 years. Paper lanterns swaying in the breeze, the sweet scent of festival food, and Isabella's laughter as they shared takoyaki beneath the blooming trees. They had been study partners first, then friends, then something more precious and complicated. "We were different people then," Isabella continued, watching David trace his younger self in the photograph. "You were already being courted by top firms, preparing for your judicial clerkship. I was just a scholarship student with dreams of international law." Luna sat quietly, absorbing every word, every gesture. The familiar dimple appeared in David's cheek as he smiled at the memory, and she unconsciously touched her own cheek where the same dimple appeared when she smiled. "When I received the fellowship offer from Sewell National University, it seemed like fate's way of making the decision for us." Isabella's voice caught slightly. "You were engaged to Catherine, planning your perfect future. I wouldn't destroy that." David's head snapped up. "Catherine and I never married. The engagement ended 2 months after you left." His voice held decades of questions. "I tried to find you, Isabella. Your phone was disconnected, your email abandoned." Isabella brushed away a tear. "By then, I knew I was pregnant. My sister Grace helped me move to New York, then eventually back here to San Francisco. I convinced myself I was protecting everyone. You, your career, your family's legacy in the legal community." Luna watched the pain and regret dance across her mother's face. "Mom sends the child support checks back every month," she said suddenly, causing both adults to turn to her in surprise. "I saw her do it once. She marks them return to sender and puts them in the blue mailbox on corner of 24th Street. David ran a hand through his silver-streaked hair. "All this time, I had my investigators searching everywhere after the first check was returned. The money came from a trust fund. I hoped you'd eventually accept it, give me some way to find you." He looked at Luna with wonder. "I never knew, never imagined. I built a good life for us," Isabella said firmly, reaching for Luna's hand. "Art curation let me use my law degree differently, understanding international property rights and authentication. Luna has excelled at Winston Preparatory, and she's happy. But I always wondered about you," Luna interjected, her young voice steady. "Every Father's Day, every school performance, every time Mom looks sad when she thinks I'm not watching." The weight of lost years hung heavy in the room. David stood and walked to his window, overlooking the city that had held his daughter so close yet kept her so far from him. The fog had completely lifted now, leaving the bay sparkling under the midday sun. "I'm not asking for anything," Isabella began, but David turned back to face them. "But I am," he said quietly. "I'm asking for a chance to know my daughter. To make up for lost time, if you'll let me." He knelt down beside Luna's chair, meeting those eyes so like his own. I've missed so much. Your first steps, your first words. My piano recital is next month. Luna offered tentatively. I'm playing Debussy. A moment of understanding passed between them, and offering of future moments to balance the weight of the past. The following weeks unfolded like scenes from a dream. David took emergency personal leave from the courthouse, citing family matters that required his immediate attention. His mother, Maria Ramirez, matriarch of one of San Francisco's most respected legal families, sat in stunned silence when he told her the news in the sunlit conservatory of her Pacific Heights home. A granddaughter, Maria whispered, touching the delicate gold cross at her neck. All these years, Mihijo. She reached for the photograph David had brought. Luna at her recent school performance, the familiar Ramirez dimple visible as she smiled at the camera. She has your father's eyes, just like you. The DNA testing process was handled with utmost discretion at a private medical facility in Marin County. Dr. Mei Chen, a respected geneticist who had known the Ramirez family for years, took charge of the case personally. As she drew blood from both David and Luna, she noticed how they shared the same nervous habit of tapping their left index finger when anxious. Isabella waited in the hallway during the procedure, answering emails about an upcoming exhibition at her gallery. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from Grace, her sister and only confidant all these years. Everything will work out. Grace's latest text read, "You've protected Luna this long. Trust that you made the right choice in letting the truth come out." The courthouse rumbled with speculation during David's absence. Jenny fielded endless calls from reporters, repeating the official statement about personal leave. Jackson Wong, the Chronicle reporter who witnessed the revelation, respectfully held off on publishing the story, understanding the delicate nature of the situation and the lies involved. Luna threw herself into research during the waiting period, reading everything she could find about DNA testing and inheritance patterns. Her science teacher, Mrs. Patel, noticed her sudden intense interest in genetics and quietly provided her with age-appropriate books on the subject, sensing there was more to the story than Luna was ready to share. Mitochondrial DNA comes from our mothers, Luna explained to David during one of their careful, supervised visits at a quiet cafe near the Palace of Fine Arts. But I have your nuclear DNA too. That's why I have your dimples and eye color. Her scientific approach to understanding their connection made David smile, remembering his own childhood fascination with facts and figures. When Dr. Chen's office called 2 weeks later, the results surprised no one. The 99.99% probability of paternity merely confirmed what Luna's heart had known since she found that photograph in the attic. David sat in his home office for hours that evening, staring at the official report until the words blurred together. The formal confirmation set other wheels in motion. Judge Sandra Martinez, David's colleague and friend, helped him navigate the legal implications of his situation. "You'll need to recuse yourself from family court cases for the foreseeable future," she advised during a private lunch. But David, speaking as someone who grew up without a father, "This is a gift. A complicated, beautiful gift." Maria Ramirez sprang into action, her initial shock transforming into purposeful energy. She pulled family photo albums from storage, discovering that Luna's artistic talent mirrored that of David's grandmother, Elena, whose paintings still hung in the family's dining room. She began making lists of birthdays and holidays to be celebrated, years of absence to be acknowledged and bridged. Isabella watched these preparations with a mixture of guilt and gratitude. One evening, as Luna practiced piano at home, she finally let herself cry, not from sadness or regret, but from the relief of sharing a burden carried alone for so long. The truth finally spoken had cracked open their carefully constructed world, but through those cracks, light was beginning to shine. The Golden Gate Bridge stretched across the horizon, its spans disappearing into the morning fog as Luna and David walked through Crissy Field. These Saturday morning walks had become their ritual over the past month, a neutral ground where father and daughter could slowly piece together their new reality. "Mom says I get my habit of humming while I read from you." Luna said, kicking a small stone along the path. She'd been collecting these little similarities like precious stones, each one a confirmation of their connection. David chuckled, suddenly conscious of the melody from La Vie en Rose that he'd been absently humming moments before. Your grandmother, my mother, does the same thing, he replied, watching Luna's face light up at this new piece of family history. She used to drive my father crazy, humming through her law books late at night. They stopped at their usual bench, where Isabella would join them later with coffee and the egg tarts from Golden Gate Bakery that had become their traditional breakfast. The early morning dog walkers and joggers passed by, none aware of the small miracle unfolding on this weathered wooden bench. At David's office, his colleagues had adjusted to the change in his demeanor. The stern, sometimes distant judge had been replaced by someone more contemplative, more present. Jenny noticed he'd added a small framed photo to his desk. Luna at her piano, caught mid-laugh during practice. His calendar now included mysterious blocks marked simply L, music, or L, park. Isabella watched these developing bonds with complex emotions. During their weekly dim sum meetings at Lai Hong Lounge, she observed how Luna's expressions mirrored David's, how they both methodically organized their chopsticks and napkins before eating, how their eyes crinkled the same way when they smiled. Grace, joining them occasionally, marveled at how natural it felt, as if the years of separation were slowly dissolving over plates of hargao and shumei. She asked about your law school awards. Isabella mentioned to David one afternoon as they watched Luna feeding the koi in the Japanese tea garden. I showed her the Stanford Law Review articles you wrote. She's read them all. David glanced at their daughter, who was carefully measuring out fish food portions with scientific precision. I found her art portfolio online, he admitted. The school's website has a whole gallery of her work. That watercolor series she did of San Francisco fog. It's extraordinary. The process wasn't always smooth. There were moments of awkwardness, of uncertainty about boundaries and roles. Luna's questions sometimes cut deep. Why didn't you look harder for us? She asked David one day. Why didn't you trust him with the truth? She challenged Isabella on another. But beneath the difficult questions lay a fierce desire to understand, to connect, to belong. Maria Ramirez proved to be the unexpected bridge they all needed. She hosted Sunday dinners at her home, filling the formal dining room with the scent of her legendary pala and the sound of Luna learning family stories. She taught Luna to make traditional Mexican hot chocolate, the same recipe she had taught David decades ago, creating new memories while honoring old traditions. One evening, as David drove Luna home from her piano lesson, she asked to stop at the courthouse. The building was quiet, most of its daily drama concluded. They stood in the empty courtroom 7A, where their story had broken open just weeks before. I was so scared that day, Luna admitted, her voice echoing slightly in the empty space. But also brave, like Grandma Maria's stories about great-grandmother Elena crossing the border alone to give her children a better life. David placed his hand gently on her shoulder, feeling the weight of generations, of courage and choices, of secrets and revelations, of love lost and found again. Through the tall windows, the setting sun painted the room in shades of gold, a fitting backdrop for this moment of quiet understanding between father and daughter. The winter fog wrapped around San Francisco like a soft gray blanket as guests arrived at Nopalito Restaurant for Luna's 11th birthday celebration. The private room buzzed with a mixture of English, Spanish, and Mandarin conversations, a symphony of the worlds that had collided and merged over the past 3 months. Isabella had spent hours planning the perfect fusion of cultures for this milestone celebration. Origami cranes, folded by Luna and her grandmother Maria during their Sunday crafting sessions, hung alongside traditional papel picado. The birthday cake, a masterpiece from B Patisserie, combined Luna's favorite green tea flavor with Mexican chocolate layers. David arrived early, carrying a carefully wrapped package that had required weeks of preparation. He watched Luna greet her guests, her best friend Mai from Winston Preparatory, her piano teacher Mrs. Rodriguez, her art club members, and various members of the now extended Ramirez family. She moved between groups with grace, the confidence of knowing she belonged in all these worlds evident in her smile. "The judge looks different," Jackson Wong whispered to Jenny Martinez, both having been included in this intimate celebration. Indeed, David's usual courtroom gravity had softened, replaced by an ease that came from finally being whole. He had returned to the bench 2 weeks ago, but now presided exclusively over civil cases, a change that felt right for this new chapter of his life. Grace appeared with her camera, capturing candid moments that would join the growing collection of family photographs on Maria's living room walls. "Remember when we used to hide these memories?" she murmured to Isabella, showing her a shot of Luna teaching her cousins how to use chopsticks. Isabella squeezed her sister's hand, grateful for the years of unwavering support. When it came time for gifts, David's package drew everyone's attention. Luna carefully unwrapped it to reveal a leather-bound book. Opening it, her eyes widened at the sight of newspaper clippings, photographs, and handwritten notes, a chronicle of the Ramirez family's legal legacy in San Francisco, updated to include her own story. "Your great-grandfather opened one of the first Hispanic-owned law firms in the city," David explained, his voice soft with pride. "And your great-grandmother on your mother's side was one of the first female gallery owners in Chinatown. You come from a long line of pioneers, Meja." The last page held a court document, official paperwork acknowledging David's paternity and granting him legal rights as Luna's father. But it was the handwritten note beneath it that brought tears to Luna's eyes. Some families are born, others are chosen, and the luckiest ones are a bit of both. Maria brought out her guitar later in the evening, teaching Luna the ballads she had once sung to David. Isabella joined them, her clear voice carrying the Mandarin lullabies of Luna's early years. The languages and melodies intertwined, creating something entirely new and perfectly their own. As the party wound down, Luna found a quiet moment with both her parents on the restaurant's heated patio. Above them, strings of lights twinkled like stars against the foggy sky. "I was so afraid that day in court," she admitted, "but something inside me knew it was the right moment." David and Isabella exchanged glances over their daughter's head. The past months had taught them that truth, however delayed, had its own timeline. Their weekly family dinners, shared school events, and carefully coordinated holidays were creating a new normal that felt surprisingly natural. "Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is trust our hearts," Isabella said, wrapping an arm around Luna's shoulders, "even when it seems impossible." And sometimes, David added, thinking of that fateful morning in Courtroom 7A, the impossible becomes possible because someone is brave enough to speak their truth. Luna nodded, understanding now that family wasn't just about sharing DNA or living under the same roof. It was about choice and courage, about forgiveness and fresh starts. As she looked out at the fog-wrapped city, she smiled, knowing that her story, their story, was still just beginning.